There we go. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Student Safety Abroad Parent Webinar. It is December 9th. We are live here on the Notre Dame campus. You might be able to hear the bells from the Basilica going off behind us. So it's 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to participate in the webinar. My name is Tom Guinan. I'm the Associate Vice President for Administrative Operations here at Notre Dame International, joined by Robert Norton, who's the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Research, and Rosemary Max, who is our Director of International Programs. Just a few administrative items before we get into the webinar itself. This presentation is being recorded, and the slides and the video will be available early next week on our website. We're going to make sure we have everything set up correctly and then posted on the website. We are not taking questions live this evening, but I do appreciate all those. We had about 25 questions come in before the webinar, and so thank you to those who sent those in. Please continue to do so afterwards. We will try to respond to each of those questions individually. I think some of the questions are specific enough that they warrant an individual response. We'll try to get to those, each one of them, within the week. And then we'll also use those questions and any questions that come out as a result of this webinar to post a Q&A section on our webpage so that that'll be available to you as a resource as well. Before we get into the agenda, I did want to also just mention that this is the first time Notre Dame International is presenting something of this format to parents. I think it's part of an ongoing initiative we have to just provide parents with more resources, more accessible resources, either via the web or via live webinars like this or other formats. This might not be the best venue because we're not able to interact with you, but it's one of several ways that we're going to try and reach out to you regularly throughout the year, realizing that the specific focus right now for this particular webinar is for those parents who have students who are going abroad in the spring of 2016 or who may be abroad currently. So for the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit just about recent events, things that have happened that we're all familiar with. Rosemary will then give some background on the variety and the breadth of our study abroad programs. The main focus of the webinar is obviously on health and safety, and so we'll spend some time around that topic, specifically focusing on student, parent, and Notre Dame roles in supporting health and safety. And then we'll talk a little bit more about other items for parents to consider that are not so dire as health and safety. And finally, with the time that we have left, which will be, we're expecting that this will run an hour, we'll review some of the questions that have been submitted, not in detail verbatim, but just themes that came up through the questions themselves. I will point out that I am not only a moderator of this webinar, but I am also a participant because I am a parent of a student who will be going abroad in the spring of 2016 to Rome. I think my wife is watching now. She better be watching now. And I thank her for putting up with probably 10 versions of this presentation that she had to sit through over this past week. So we'll get right into it. I'll ask Robert Norton to just give some background on recent events that will help us frame the discussion for today.
Thanks, Tom. As Tom mentioned, this is something we have not done before at NDI, and it's obvious, I think, that one of the major reasons that we are doing this now is because of the extraordinarily tragic events that took place recently in Paris and related events, excuse me. And these have understandably and appropriately caused people within Notre Dame, but also outside of Notre Dame, to be reasonably concerned about the many programs that our students take part in, and not only, of course, in Europe, but throughout the rest of the world. And we see it as our responsibility to proactively address those concerns, but also to respond to the concerns that have come to us, as Tom just said. In addition, of course, there have been many alerts, warnings, and news stories, again, produced both within Notre Dame, but of course in international media, that have added to concerns. Most of the information is reasonably accurate, depending on the news source. Some information, I think, of course, depends on the the messenger conveying that information. And one of our responsibilities, of course, is to make sure that the information that we do communicate both internally, but also with the wider community and beyond, is as accurate as it possibly can be, as we can possibly make it. One of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that while we're all focused primarily, I have to say, on the safety of our students and our staff and all of the members of the Notre Dame community, there is no guarantee for safety. And that's true here on campus and within the South Bend community. It's also true around the rest of the world. This is a common sense observation, but I think it's one that often can get lost, especially in crisis situations where, of course, and naturally, our concerns are focused on our loved ones. And I think we sometimes overestimate the degree of control that we have over events, which is not to say that we in any way abdicate our responsibilities, but ultimately there is no absolute guarantee that we can make. We do the best that we possibly can, and we exert ourselves to the extent that we can, but ultimately when we are out in the world, we are exposed to the risks in the world. We minimize those risks by making sure that we prepare our students, our faculty, our staff, as well as we can through informational meetings, through training, through constant information and communication, and so on, before they leave, during the time that they are abroad, and of course even after they return, so that we can learn important lessons about what we did well, but also where we might actually improve what we do. One of the most important things also that we tell to our students and to our faculty if they're going abroad is to make sure that they are attentive to their surroundings, that they make sure that they're not complacent when it comes to even simple things like making sure that they register with the appropriate authorities, that they happen to be located in a certain place. We need to make sure that people are aware that, especially in an environment that's very different from the one that they're used to at home or here at Notre Dame, that they know that certain assumptions that they may make while they're here, they can't necessarily make while they're abroad, that they need to make sure that something as simple as getting in a taxi or taking a bus or taking a train or just walking down the street may involve a different set of decisions that they might actually be involved in while they're here at home. And so heightening awareness about what kinds of situations they might find themselves in and what kinds of decisions and choices they may have to make, I think, is one of the most important things we can do to ensure the safety of everyone who travels abroad. All of that having been said, I think, especially in times of crisis or in the aftermath of crises, I think we tend to focus on those, again, for very understandable and appropriate reasons, those crises, and sometimes a little bit lose sight of the overall purpose of sending our students abroad and in immersing them, having them immerse themselves in different cultures and different societies, speaking different languages. And that is, in fact, to allow them to avail themselves of opportunities, educational opportunities, life opportunities that are available in no other way. We at Notre Dame send an extraordinarily high percentage of our students abroad, as you know, and we're very proud of that. It's something that's a signal attribute of the University of Notre Dame, and we have no intention of changing that, nor should we change that. And it really is a core element of the education that the students here at Notre Dame receive, and it's one that goes to the very core identity of the university as a whole. As a Catholic university, we are concerned about the universal human experience and the universality of the values that we uphold. And those values and the universality of those values, I think, are best experienced when the students see that they are also brought to fruition. They're experienced in cultures that can be quite different from the ones that they come from. So even at that level, I think, it's not something that really is come up as a possibility here at Notre Dame. But what we do want to do is make sure that the students that we do send abroad still are prepared to the best of our ability, and that we bring them home safely as well.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you very much for that. Now, just to give you a sense more about the scope of our programs, Rosemary is going to share with you some information about just the study abroad, the whole study abroad program that we operate here at Notre Dame.
Thanks, Tom. This slide will give you a little bit of information on the context and the types of programs that our students travel to. So for spring 2016, we have, as you can see, about 430 undergraduate students going abroad, and they're on a whole range of programs. Programs break down into 3 types. Global gateway locations, so those are places where Notre Dame has building, staff, property. London and Dublin being the largest, Rome is somewhere in the middle size-wise, and Jerusalem and Beijing being a little bit smaller. So you can see the vast majority of our students are at our global gateway locations. There are other programs where Notre Dame does not have a gateway, but we have staff that report to us on the ground, and those are in Santiago and Puebla in Mexico, Angers in France, and in Sao Paulo. And then we also work a lot with third-party providers, and those may be a university overseas that a student has a direct enrollment in that university, or another example would be many of our students use large study abroad providers when they go overseas. So those are large outfits that are used to running study abroad programs around the world. You'll hear something about personal travel throughout this presentation, and so Notre Dame does not monitor or approve personal travel and activities that students undertake personally while students are abroad and at any of our sites or at our host institutions. So this means that if we certainly know about programmatic activities that are going on, but if students are undertaking personal travel on the weekends, we know about that if they let us know about it, and you'll hear more about that throughout this presentation. At all of our sites, we support student health and safety while abroad in coordination with other resources. And so those resources are our colleagues that are on the ground in all these places, the State Department, and their insurance package, which you'll hear a little bit about also in this presentation. These are all things that help keep students safe when they're on the ground in the study abroad program.
Thanks, Rosemary. So getting into now the sort of the heart of our presentation, our focus on health and safety, I thought it would be helpful to have a visual just to kind of show you what Rosemary was just describing about the support structures and the elements of support for health and safety that are available to students. With the sort of understanding, as we talk to the students about that, the students themselves are the ones who make choices that will impact their health and safety most directly. They are the ones, as Robert mentioned, the choices they make walking down the street, getting into a cab, and ways that they can impact their health and safety. They are the ones most primarily responsible and can impact their health and safety beyond any of the other groups that are shown here. So the phrase we use with the students is that we say they must take ownership of their health and safety, and that ownership begins before they even leave for their programs. And then, as Robert mentioned, it also does translate to when they come back and the fact that they can share with us information about what worked and what didn't work. So in this little graphic here, we'll spend a lot of time in subsequent slides speaking about the 2 top right bubbles, the Notre Dame resources on site and abroad, and then also the parents. But I did want to talk about the other 4 bubbles, if you will, just to give you a sense of what those resources are and how important they can be. So on the left top portion, HTH insurance. This is something that you as parents should be familiar with, and we encourage the students to familiarize themselves with this as well. It's a comprehensive, tailored physical and mental health insurance package that every student is enrolled in terms of they have a policy number, and they are required to show us that policy number and post it into our system before they leave. And so every student, whether they know it or not, has an HTH insurance policy. That has proven to be critically effective in situations involving students' personal health and well-being. They have immediate access to medical resources wherever they are, essentially around the world, and also access to the insurance provider as well in terms of support for things like travel, parent travel, et cetera. The U.S. Department of State is a very important partner for all colleges and universities, United States colleges and universities that send students abroad. They post messages on the U.S. Department of State website in times of crisis, but they also have a program that it's called the STEP program, the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, that we also require all students to enroll in before they leave. And so they enroll in, you enroll in the STEP program by location. So we require all students to enroll in the STEP location for their program site. But as important, we also strongly recommend that students really enroll, you sort of enter your destination information when they do engage in the personal travel that Rosemary mentioned. The STEP program provides rapid notification about crisis situations in the location that you have indicated you're traveling to, and it allows students real-time access to what the U.S. government or the related consular affairs or embassy offices are saying in a particular location. It's a very important resource, and it's something that we remind the students of repeatedly, that they should enroll periodically as they travel abroad. Rosemary also mentioned the importance of our relationship with third-party host orientation institutions. And one thing that you as parents, many of you have asked, what is my student going to learn or be told when they're on the ground, when they arrive in their location? And especially for those who are participating with third-party or host institution programs, those students will receive an orientation when they arrive at their location. They may have been getting information already, but those organizations and institutions have their own protocols for health and safety, where they will be they are expert and providers of these services, and they will orient the students. And so the students will have more information, certainly when they arrive on the ground, basic things like fire drills, what to do, where the local hospital is, and also more operational details. Where is the cafeteria? How do I get to the local church, and things like that. And then the last item in this graphic is local government resources. We remind students that when they are overseas, they have access to police and medical resources as they would here, in the sense of if there is an emergency, if there is a crime, if they're a victim, if they're in an accident, they should know what the local police number is, the 911 equivalent number, and contact the local police. They are resources for students while they are abroad, and they're primary emergency resources as they would be here. And so those are items that we just wanted to present to you as parents, so that you know it's not simply you and Notre Dame supporting the students, that there are other mechanisms in place that the students have access to. We wanted to share with you, if your students haven't already, and I'm sure they haven't, that we have mandatory information sessions that the students attend prior to their semester going abroad. And so we recently held those sessions. One was last Thursday on December 3rd, and then one was just this past Monday. And these sessions are focused on identifying what we consider to be, and based on student feedback, the most prevalent risk areas that we want to bring to the students' attention. We present these items that I have listed here really in the order, in what we understand is the order of occurrence, if you will. So we see more mental health and anxiety issues than any other risk factor that students experience across all of our programs. We present these, we actually have students present these. So students who have gone abroad come back and present on these topics. And then after each topic, we share with the students the online resources that are available to help them manage and mitigate these risks. Without going into all of these in detail, I did want to highlight a couple that you as parents should be aware of and particularly focus on, with acknowledging that you should speak with your students about all of these risks. I think you have these now, and you can really focus on them and see which ones might be most relevant for my particular child. But alcohol and drugs, we know we can kind of see how they could become big risk factors when students are abroad, and particularly alcohol. When students find themselves in locations, mainly in Europe, but elsewhere, where they are of legal drinking age and they have easy access to alcohol of any kind, that we want to remind students not to put themselves in risky situations as a result of alcohol, because these risk factors are present here on campus if you actually consider them and go down them one by one. When you're in a new location, in an urban location that you're not familiar with, or even in a rural location, and you find yourself incapacitated or that your judgment is compromised because of alcohol, you're at greater risk for having something happen to you. And so we remind students that the risks are exacerbated, and you just don't want to find yourself in a situation where your judgment is compromised, your safety is compromised because of alcohol intake. And then the other item that's highlighted in yellow is the communication plan. We encourage you and your students to at least set up a framework for communication plan while the student is abroad. And so that framework could be, generally, I will text you, I will call you, I will email you once a week, once a day, once an hour, depending on what your relationship is like. But we also then would recommend you and encourage you to test this plan to make sure that once your student gets on the ground and they perhaps pick up a new cell phone with a SIM card, or they insert a SIM card for their location, that you can get in touch with them, that you actually can text them. And if you can't text them, that you perhaps look at another app that would work, that would be accessible to both of you. Because we found that communication plans can fall apart rapidly. For instance, if a student just says, well, you know, I'm turning off all of my mobile services because I don't want to get charged for roaming fees. And that causes problems when the parent is trying to get in touch with the student, when we're trying to get in touch with the student. So really consider what that communication plan is like, what would work. And it's almost certain that you'll have to adapt to it once the student is abroad for 2 or 3 months and feels comfortable with their surroundings and you feel comfortable with them being abroad. Our next few slides are going to be focused specifically on crisis situations. And so by crisis situations, we mean, from the previous slide, you saw terrorist attacks, which are probably on the front of mind for most people, but also situations such as earthquakes, natural disasters, volcanic ash clouds. We've experienced all of these this semester. In the last 3 months, we've experienced each of those incidents in different parts of the world. And so we are going to speak a little bit about the student, parent, and Notre Dame interactions in crisis situations and what each one can do and is prepared to do in a crisis situation. So specifically with the students, I mentioned earlier that they will receive on-site orientation with respect to specific protocols within their program location. So I know, for instance, London and Rome at our gateway locations, they have a full day set aside for orientation around living in those locations and what to do in emergencies. We then encourage students to plan ahead, and as Robert mentioned, be aware of where you are, local resources, what's happening in the location that you are in. Check local news sources, find a good local news source and find out what's happening in a particular area. You know, if you can imagine a big city like London or Rome or other locations where we send our students, there are things happening in those cities every day that may impact travel, that may impact accessibility of certain locations. So the students should become familiar with their location. That's part of the immersion in the cultures, understanding how people actually live in these locations. Again, we remind students repeatedly to ensure that their cell phone is working, that it's working in the locations they may travel on the weekends or on their personal travel, that they have service, that they have battery power, and that they can receive the basic data functions that the phones are capable of. One point that's essential, and I think as parents you would probably appreciate this, is that we need updated contact information for the students. And so contact information is not only just the students' cell phone information and also their location information if they happen to be away from their program, but we also need them to update us with your contact information. And so I think many of you are participating in this webinar today because you got an email that was provided to us by your student, which is good. And we want to make sure that if any of those contacts change, if you change an email address or anything like that, the student lets us know, because when we need to get in touch with you or with students, we use multiple sources of communication: cell phone, text, email, you know, you name it. We'll try it if we need to get in touch with people. So having good information is critical for us. And then this next point is probably is a complement to the updated contact information. We can only help students, as Rosemary mentioned, if we know where they are at a given period of time. And so on most days, on most weekdays, when students are in class, we can say with a fair degree of certainty they are in their program location. But we also know that travel within travel, or what we call personal travel while students are abroad, is a very prominent aspect of the students' plans and their experience, and one of the reasons they choose to go abroad. We repeatedly, and we ask you to repeatedly encourage your students to register those travel plans. We have an online system where the students can register those travel plans. It's a fairly easy process, just dates and locations, so that we know where they are in the event that we need to get a hold of them. We don't approve those travel plans, but we do use the information they enter contact them in the event of an emergency. And the contact with those students is only successful if you consider the next bullet point, which is that the students have to respond to these confirmation requests. And so we encourage them to, in the context of their local awareness, to actually anticipate when people may be looking for them, whether it's their on-site coordinators or Notre Dame International or you as parents, that they check their phones, that if they see that something has happened that could be potentially significant, they take their phones out, they turn on their data plan, and they consider whether or not people are looking for them. And if not, be proactive and take the step to contact somebody, whether it's you as parents or our program coordinators here, to say, I'm okay, I'm fine, and I understand something's happened, and I just want to let you know I'm okay. And in between all that, we encourage them also just to stay calm and focused. Again, this is advice that any of us would get in a crisis situation. Stay calm, stay focused, look towards your own safety and the safety of those around you who you're maybe traveling with, and just remember what you were told as part of your preparation and part of your orientation. From Notre Dame's perspective, our main focus in the immediate moments of a crisis is to confirm and assist. And so by confirming, we look to identify all students who may be in a particular location that is impacted by an event. And we then reach out to those students, again, through multiple methods, whether it's email, text, or cell phone call, depending on what we think is most effective. And we confirm their location and their well-being. And it's important that we know where they are in the given setting, and also that they are safe and that they will remain safe in the sense that they're able to maintain safety, because in a crisis situation, they sometimes linger. And so as you can recall with Paris, that event played out over 3 to 4 hours. And so confirming safety is an ongoing process for us. And we do occasionally run into situations where students have need. So we confirm their location, but they may need assistance. And so we coordinate with the students. And in those instances, we bring the parents into the discussion, because they may have information as well that could be helpful for us in supporting the students. And they may also just want to act in terms of perhaps traveling out to the student location. We also are responsible at Notre Dame International for communicating to university leadership the status of students who are abroad. And so we have formal responsibility to the president, the provost, and the executive vice president. And then we also coordinate our response, depending on the magnitude of the event, with the university's Emergency Operations Committee, which is the large-scale disaster response committee that is chaired by the president, and the executive vice president, I should say. And an important aspect of our response, which I mentioned earlier in terms of other resources, we immediately sort of canvass the higher ed community, the government groups that support overseas safety, to just understand how other institutions are responding to a particular crisis. If you can imagine, with the Paris attacks, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of US schools that have programs in Paris. And so we had our risk management coordinator spending a lot of her time in the immediate aftermath of the immediate minutes following the attack, just gathering information about what other schools were experiencing, and then sharing that information so that we could say, oh, this approach is working well, or shut off communications in this quadrant of the city. So it helps us to have networks and relationships that we can leverage in times of crisis with our peer institutions and with government resources. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the team that we have here that's responsible for supporting health and safety of our students abroad, we have our own incident response team here at Notre Dame International, which is led by Nick Entrikin, who's the vice president and associate provost. Nick's primary role is to ensure that we're doing what we need to be doing, but also to be communicating with university leadership as needed or as they request. Robert, Rosemary, and I are in that mix as well. And then we have other key support staff that play essential roles in different aspects of an incident response that help us to coordinate our response, not only internally, but also with respect to the students. And then for those 270 plus students who are at our global gateway locations, we do also have the capacity to have formalized incident response teams in those locations as well. And so they serve as resources on the ground for students. They have the same sort of activation protocols as we do here to rapidly respond to incidents that may take place in those locations. Rosemary's going to share a little bit now about parents' roles and what they can do to support students in crisis situations.
Thanks, Tom. So parents, you're also very important in this process. And we talked to your students about all the things that Tom has mentioned. And we mentioned that we just had the safety summit with them on December 3rd and December 7th. We push out messages to them on a whole range of things throughout the year, and especially as they're preparing to go abroad. But it's always good for parents to know some of the key things we're expecting from the students and to maybe encourage them and remind students of the steps that we think are critical and important. And so ensuring contact information is correct and in our system. So we'll remind students about not only about their new contact information as they arrive at their sites, but to make sure that they have given us the most updated contact information for you. And that's very important. That's where everything starts in terms of our response if something happens. And so you can reinforce that message with your student. Registering personal travel with Notre Dame. And so we have a system for this. We just rolled it out this semester, and we're encouraging students in many different ways to let us know where they are. In an emergency, we'll look up that information and try to help them, but we can only do that if we know where they are. And so any encouragement that you can give students to use that system would be wonderful. Again, responding to confirmation requests from us, that's another key area of reinforcement that we would hope that students would get from family members. And then many times students forget that they have HTH insurance. So most kids are not focused on insurance. I know I certainly wasn't when I was their age. And so students may call you first, usually if something happens to them, if they get hurt or if they, sprain their ankle or whatever it may be, or they'll reach out to us. And we always say, have you called HTH? Have you opened up a case on yourself? Are you getting the information that you need to in terms of getting to a hospital or a doctor that'll be suited for whatever it is that you're experiencing? And so students sometimes say, oh, I forgot I had that. And so I think it's very important. And usually parents won't forget that they have this insurance package. And so if students forget, then parents, just a reminder that to your students, if they do reach out to you and they need medical attention, they do have this very powerful insurance package, and anything you can do to kind of reinforce that with them is great. And you can also keep a copy of their, you can ask them for a copy of their insurance card. Anybody can open a case on a student. I can call up and open a case on a student. You can call up and open a case on a student and say, the student needs attention, they need to go to a hospital, and this they'll start helping with finding resources for the student. Registering for the STEP program. We talked about the State Department's program. This is great because you get messages that are specific to your location, and you as family members can also register for the STEP program and get the same messages that the students will get. I think another one that's maybe a little more, not as clear, but maybe a little more conceptual is like to just support and talk to your students about making smart decisions, especially with respect to personal travel. I find that transportation and modes of transportation and taking the cheapest train or plane, students are usually budget conscious and they're looking for the cheapest way to get from point A to point B. But sometimes what happens is that means they arrive at their destination late at night and they don't know, what to do next. And so we had a student who stood up at the State Safety Summit and talked about her experience arriving late in a train station in Italy and not having a lot of options. And she, admitted that she found the cheapest ticket and that was just suited for her. And I know that myself, when I was a student, I did the same thing and had the same experience in Barcelona. And so I think that just planning out travel and modes of transportation and making smart decisions about arrival someplace and what you do when you arrive there, we encourage your students to think about that. And you may know more about a student's personal travel and what their plans are than we do. And so it's just always a good idea to talk to your students about it. And then obviously we're always here, and our information and our phone numbers and contacting us is always a great idea. If you feel that there's an issue, if you have a hunch about something, or you just feel uneasy about something that is happening or something you think might be happening, you can always call us.
Thanks, Rosemary. We're going to shift the focus now a bit to talk specifically about two recent crisis examples. One that's very familiar to you all and one that happened it seemed like it was a long time ago. It was only 3 months ago, and we'll talk about that in a second. Just to frame this discussion, though, I think any health and safety professional or any risk management professional will say you always learn by going through a crisis. And so certainly we know what we did well during the Paris attacks, and we also have a better understanding of what we can do better when the next crisis arises. And in fact, we're in the midst of a sort of what we call after incident reviews, just to catalog all the different points where we can potentially look at ways to enhance our procedures so that we can respond and support the students more effectively, that we can support our faculty and staff, and that we can support parents more effectively. So it was a tragedy, a terrible event, but it is something that we actually can learn from. And so I wanted to just walk through with you a high-level slide about what we did in the immediate and subsequent time after the Paris attacks. So we learned of the attacks via one of the many news feeds that one of our staff actually participates in. And if you remember how the attack itself unfolded, it was initially presented as a shooting at a restaurant. And so we kept up on the news feeds that were coming in through the various news sources, and then quickly began to realize this is a bit more than just a shooting at a restaurant. And so we immediately took the steps that were outlined earlier, where we determined who was supposed to be in Paris programmatically, and then initiated contacts with the students in Paris, other regions in France. We have a program in rural France, and then broaden the contact net, if you will, to all of our programs in Europe. We had the unusual benefit of an event that was taking place in London, and so much of our confirmation activities were focused on the fact that most students happened to be in London that weekend. Most students from around Europe happened to be in London that weekend. But we did take steps to confirm the well-being of the specific student who found herself in Paris at the time of the attacks. We did encounter issues, though, and some of these issues are things that we've kind of alluded to earlier. We had initially the wrong phone number. There was a transposition error in the phone number for the student that we were trying to contact in Paris. It was Friday evening. It was Friday the 13th, but it was Friday evening, Europe time, if you will. And so most of the students had left their program locations and had traveled. But as Rosemary mentioned, we had limited registration of the personal travel within our online system. And so our lookups did not tell us that most of the students actually were in London. And so, of course, this extended the communication and confirmation process, because then we had to go to other modes of confirmation, which were less structured and less reliable and just simply take longer. And so in a crisis situation, we're always looking to find ways to make that process more compact and efficient. And then we had inconsistent response rates from students. They are responsive when they know that they're being contacted, but we also encountered situations where students just didn't have their phones with them. Students didn't have their phones on them. I will say, though, that the students themselves are a very collegial group, and so we did rely a lot on students telling other students to look at their phones and confirm their well-being, that people were looking for them. So we also advised students at the outset to look after other students on their programs or who are noted students that they may encounter. We did send a note to students, all students abroad, on November 14th in the morning. So that was a Saturday morning our time, just reminding them about the communication training that they were given, also about the care that they should take around travel in terms of registering for the State Department programs, paying attention to the warnings that were coming out of Paris and then other locations as the days went on, and then also advising them of the support resources that they have available either for counseling or other needs through the HTH insurance that Rosemary talked about. And so that message was then posted on our website so that parents could see it as well. But it was something that we felt was important to get out to the students in the immediate aftermath of the attack, because while really only one person was immediately impacted by the attacks on the ground, everyone in Europe was all of a sudden aware of this very tragic event. The Paris attacks also resulted in subsequent issues. I think, as you may recall, the events themselves ended relatively quickly, but there were travel disruptions that arose as a result of the attacks, and so many of the students who were away from their programs had concerns about how they would get back in time for their classes in their program location. So we had to work with students to provide them lodging, and then also make sure they had a way to get back to their locations. And we very quickly had questions from the students, from you, from faculty here on campus about what do we do now with our programs? Do we cancel all of our programs? Do we cancel all of our outings that may take us from London, let's say, over to Brussels, or from central France to Strasbourg in France? And what do I do about my personal travel plans as a student? And so we had to address those questions in some ways in a case-by-case basis, but we did want to acknowledge that they were out there and that students were really asking fundamental questions about what's happening with the rest of their program. In the midst of all that, you'll also recall that there were a number of alerts. I just highlighted a couple of them that we were aware of and responded to. France, of course, went into a state of emergency immediately following the attacks. Brussels had the imminent attack threat on November 21st, so which was a little more than a week after the attacks, and they remained in that mode for a number of days. And then there was a worldwide travel alert, which, in a lot of ways that caused more confusion than good, because it essentially said the whole world is at risk if you're an American, is a risk factor for you as an American traveler. And so we had to be aware that you as parents saw those notices, that students saw them, and that others in the Notre Dame community saw them as well. And our responses to those were, again, case by case, and I'll talk a little bit about how we approach those types of information sources as we go on into the presentation. But we did also want to reaffirm to the students who are going abroad in the spring that at that point, and still at this point, we have no plans to curtail or adjust any of our spring study abroad programs. And that's, as Robert said, it's not to say that we are naive and that we are unaware of the risks that are out there and the increased risk factors, but we do just reemphasize to students the importance of the health and safety precautions that they can take and make them aware of the resources that are available to them. Because the truth is, we have always told students that there is a risk of natural disaster, terrorist attack, or other crisis that could happen in any location. And those incidents could also be things like riots or demonstrations that we may never even hear about here on campus, but that may take place in their location. And we want the students to be prepared for all of those eventualities, not simply the ones that we see come across our news feeds, because those are ones that could impact the students even more directly, and we would have less opportunity of actually knowing about them other than having the student themselves advise us of what's happening. The other incident, which is certainly not as impactful to the vast majority of students abroad, but was a very significant event when it happened, which was the Chilean earthquake that took place on September 16th, around 8 o'clock our time here in South Bend. It was a huge earthquake, and if you know the geography of South America, Chile is essentially all coast with a very thin inland mountainous area. And there were tsunami warnings that were issued for up and down South America, up to California, out to Australia. So this was a major event. We have about 15 students who are in Chile each semester, and they stay with host families, and they are a very tight-knit group. And so we were able to, and we also have a resource on the ground, a Notre Dame staff on the ground. So it's an incredibly effective resource in terms of reaching out to students quickly, anytime, day or night, and accounting for them. So by 10 o'clock, we knew all of our students were safe and in Santiago. We did encounter some issues, though. One of the Chilean program directors actually happened to be here in South Bend at the time of the earthquake, and so he was coordinating the response from the Morris Inn and had scheduled to go back to Chile the next day. And so we had to work around what was he able to do in terms of response and what could the other resource on the ground do. We did have a systems glitch, if you will, in that we had a student who had a broad itinerary, and we couldn't actually tell if that student was in Chile at the specific date of the earthquake, and she happened to be in Argentina. But I mentioned this because we reached out to the parent when we could not get in touch with the student, just to confirm with the parent where the student was, and it was a grateful response from the parent. I think we were grateful to receive the response that she was in Argentina and safe. And then as a follow-on to that, this is something that comes up in any crisis, as I mentioned, with even Paris. The students had a trip planned to go to a coastal town the next day. And the towns themselves, many towns were devastated by the waves that had come in, and there was still some threat of aftershocks. And so the program director said, we're going to cancel that trip. Don't go to the town that day. Let things settle down. Let the region recover, and then perhaps we can do it later on in the semester. So those are two examples of just situations that we deal with, that we should expect, that they don't happen regularly, but we can expect every semester something will happen where we will consider a crisis and we'll have to respond. And so we present that because, as Robert mentioned, we can't guarantee these things won't happen. Our best approach is to prepare internally ourselves, to prepare your students, and also to prepare you. And we hope to continue to improve upon those preparation and those response protocols every semester. Every incident that we encounter, we want to learn from and improve on. We do find ourselves in a lot of gray area, non-crisis situations where some constituents may expect responses, others may say, no, that's not really worth it because we're going to sort of oversaturate students and parents with communications. It's not always easy to tell whether or not a situation rises to the level of crisis, if you will, where we would have to activate our incident response team and really consider broad communication and response plans. And so when we have non-crisis events, notifications, warnings, alerts, things that come to students' attention or come to our attention, we advise the students to just follow the same guidance that we presented earlier in crisis situations. Be aware, consider whether or not you may be contacted, respond timely, make sure people know where you are, stay calm, talk to your local resources, make sure you just are familiar with what's happening. On Notre Dame's, on the home campus and even overseas as well, we assess each situation because we don't want to overreact, we don't want to underreact, and we want to make sure that we consider past experience and sources of information, as Robert said, other variables that may inform our response. We will contact either a student, groups of students, large groups of students as we deem necessary. And then we also make sure we coordinate these communications with our third party and host institutions and also our local resources so that we don't send, at the very least, redundant communications, but also the potential for inconsistent communications arises if you're not coordinating those communications with the students. And for parents, when you see something come across the news wires or see an alert or a warning, you should initially ask your students. I think that's the guidance that we give students, and we give this to you as well. Ask them what is happening on the ground. Frequently, we find out here on campus that something that makes the news here in a particular location is not necessarily news there because it's just happening in the mix of urban life in a big city. And so the students may say, oh yeah, that's not a big deal. We were told just to take a different route to our classroom building. Still, if you feel that there's just something that makes you uneasy, or if you have urgent, immediate concerns about your student or about an event, you can always contact us at the information that the phone information that was presented earlier, and also the ND International website, webmail address that we gave you prior to this session. And just as an example, I didn't share this with Rosemary and Robert, but tomorrow there is a general aviation strike. You didn't know this, but there's a general aviation strike in Rome. And so the question arises, well, some students it's the end of the semester. Is anybody leaving? Do we need to tell the students anything about this, or is it something that is, resolved already? And so these are non-crisis, but they could result in some real inconvenience and hassle for students. So we just ask. We start out by asking program coordinators, what's your sensibility around this, and how would you react? And that's how we handle the vast majority of things that come our way on any given day. Rosemary is going to share with you some enhancements we've made to our health and safety protocols. These are ongoing enhancements. We're always looking to make enhancements, but I'll just ask Rosemary to share a few recent ones.
Thanks, Tom. We've talked quite a bit about the travel registration and having the contact information in our database. And so we have a new system that we've been working with for about a year, and we recently got a piece of that system that allows students to register their personal travel. And so we rolled that out around September, end of September, beginning of October was operational. And so it's a new feature for students, and we're always encouraging students to use it. So that's new for us. Exercises to confirm student contact information once they arrive on site and while abroad. And so realizing that there were several cases in which students may have put their home cell phone number that wasn't working overseas. They may have incorrectly added numbers that were transposed or something, as we had the case that Tom mentioned earlier. Or in some cases, students who maybe didn't have a cell phone number just put in their parents' contact information for their own contact information overseas. And so we're working diligently to be able to confirm and have a test run of that contact information for students when they arrive on site and have their new cell phone number. Regular updates to students regarding world and local events that might affect them, and so just doubling down and sending out more information on those. And then just here, and certainly with our partners and the gateways, is just refinement of all of our incidents response plans. As Tom mentioned, with each incident, no two incidents are the same. And with each incident, you learn something new. And so constantly refining those. And then regular parent webinars focused on health and safety considerations. So we hope this is one of a new one in a line of new tradition that we'll be starting and having more contact with parents on these issues.
Thanks, Rosemary. A question that's come up through the emails, and it's also a question we face even before the Paris attacks, is how is it determined whether or not a program or programs should be curtailed, canceled, modified? What mechanisms are in place to do that on campus? So Nick Entrikin is charged with chairing a committee that would evaluate program continuance, if you will. And it's a cross-functional committee here on campus. It involves partners from risk management and safety, student affairs, the program leaders themselves, and general counsel, other groups that just help us to make good, informed decisions. We fortunately have not had to take those steps. In the last 15 years, I think there was maybe 1 or 2 instances where we had to curtail a program, and that was due to events on the ground. But more importantly, I think a bigger question that has come up as a result of the Paris incidents and subsequent anxiety is what happens to my student if they are scheduled to go abroad and they would like to change their plans now, or what happens if my student is abroad and something happens where they either want to or are required to leave that location for whatever reason. And so we're formalizing a very broad committee. We've gathered a very broad committee to formalize these plans so that we can respond quickly to student and parent inquiries related to academic contingencies, if you will. And so the considerations that we're bringing into play are when an event happens in a particular semester will kind of help dictate what our response is. What alternate options would be available to students in terms of other locations they may be able to go to if they already are abroad. And then we also have to understand what our host institutions, our third-party partners, are doing with respect to their programs. And so, for instance, certain of our partners in Europe actually gave their students, which are our students enrolled in their programs, the option of leaving the location and finishing the semester at home online via online resources. And so that's something that we consider as well, and especially, as I mentioned, it is driven in large part by when in the semester a particular event happens. Our primary consideration after the health and safety is maintaining the students' academic progress. We do not want the students to in any way be disadvantaged by events beyond their control. And so we're working to develop plans that we can be nimble and responsive to events that may result in large-scale or individual movements away from program locations. Now, as I mentioned, we are heavy on health and safety today, but we do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about other things that parents can consider as their students prepare to go abroad in this very exciting, very hectic period as they finish up the semester and get ready to take off abroad in the spring. Go ahead.
Yep.
Rich.
So, there are a lot of students who travel overseas and they have large personal travel budgets, and other students do not. And so we always encourage students, whether they have a large budget or not, to explore their program location. Personal and weekend travel can be expensive. It can be exhausting for students, put in a full week and then to just get on a plane and fly to another city and fly back. It can really start to kind of wear on students as they go throughout the semester. Some of the students who get the most out of a study abroad experience, particularly if they're trying to improve a language, are students who stay put and really sink into the culture, into the city, into the village that their study abroad program is, rather than thinking this is the only time they'll have to travel to 15 cities in Europe on the 15 weekends that they'll have. And so it sounds, I mean, there are students who do both of those things, but we really encourage students to, consider that there is another way to study abroad, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to leave on personal and expensive travel every weekend. And we also know that sometimes families visit their students while they're overseas, which is a wonderful time for you to go and see how your student is doing overseas, how they've changed, how they've grown in their study abroad program. And so we always encourage that family, if they can visit their students, to please do, but just to think about the curriculum and the student's schedule in terms of when they'll have the free time to spend time with you as you come overseas to meet them.
Thank you, Rosemary. That's good advice for me and for our family trip to Rome. So we have a few minutes left, and I did, as I mentioned earlier, we received about 20 to 25 questions, and I'm hoping that after this webinar we'll receive many more, and I encourage you to submit questions. For the questions that we did receive, there were some recurring themes. I won't touch on those themes that I think we covered in the bulk of the presentation, but here are some 4 questions that I wanted to just highlight, and again, some it's re-emphasis, but other are new questions. So personal student travel while abroad, should it be allowed, and how does ND monitor personal travel? I think Rosemary has said several times, we don't regulate or approve or monitor student travel in the sense that they have to come to us for permission to travel. They are, as they exercise their sort of prerogative here on campus, they can leave a program location on the weekends, and many do, and they can come back and they can continue with their studies. We don't forbid or restrict any personal travel, but we do emphasize repeatedly students need to prepare and understand where they're going and make sure that they have resources available to them in the location that they are traveling to. And those locations are different every week, and the students typically haven't been there. So it's a great opportunity for students, but we do expect that they will travel, and then we just make sure that they plan as well as possible. What risk monitoring mechanisms are in place at Notre Dame and abroad? Again, to reemphasize, we have internet or online resources, if you will, industry groups that we participate in where we monitor broad events as they impact study abroad programs as a whole, but we also have local contacts, especially in our gateways with the embassies, with the local security forces, the police, the other security forces in those locations. And so we have infrastructure in place to monitor resources, and then again to respond as information comes to us, not only in terms of publicly available information, but on the ground information that we can obtain that can help us to make informed decisions about incident response. One question came up a few times: how can parents find out more specifics about their student's program? Primarily, you would contact your student, ask your student about what their program features are like. And again, I know that some of the answers that I get and I have gotten are not satisfactory. If you have questions that are important to you and you're not getting a sense that your student knows or can respond effectively, ask the student to come in to talk to us, and we'll be able to give them information that they can provide to you. If it's really a critical item, especially if it relates to things like student health and provisioning for student health while abroad, certainly contact us either through email for the program coordinator or by phone. You can just contact any one of those numbers that I sent along as well. And then lastly, while I would say 99.9% of our students actually participate in Notre Dame study abroad programs, we do have a population of students who take leave of absences to participate in study abroad programs at locations or with features that we don't offer. And so a question has come up: how does this presentation apply to students abroad who are on leave of absences from Notre Dame? And what we advise students, if they come to speak with us, and they frequently do, but also their advisors will tell them, make sure that they understand the support mechanisms that the host institution has in place, because they will be fully enrolled in those programs, and those programs will have mechanisms, probably on-site, and also if they're domestic host institutions in the States as well. And we say that not because we don't want to be bothered with the students, but we also don't want to confuse any responses where if a student is in a crisis situation and they are on a leave of absence, they should expect communications back and forth from their host institution. And if we learn of the student's situation, we can certainly help and guide the student, but we will always point them to the host institution and say, that's your first resource, and make sure you're comfortable with what resources are offered by that host institution. The bells are going off. The 7 o'clock bells.
Extraordinarily well timed, Tom.
That was not planned.
Almost as if it was planned.
The last slide contains some web information. The website where you'll find most information about study abroad is listed up there, and then certainly email questions to the intel@nd.edu email address. Again, we will have this presentation online on the internationalnd.edu website. We'll also have this video presentation online within the coming days. Thank you all very much for your time and for your attention, and we hope this was helpful for you. And we look forward to hearing back from you in whatever way you see fit. But we also just wish you and your students, particularly, great holiday season, great Christmas season, and a great experience when they go abroad in the spring of 2016. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.